All right, folks, buckle up, because today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that's guaranteed to make your brain do a few somersaults. We're talking about metaethics, specifically the clash between moral cognitivism and non-cognitivism.
And what makes this deep dive particularly fascinating is that we're not going to get bogged down in those typical ethical dilemmas, the should I lie to protect a friend or is eating meat morally justifiable kind of questions.
Yeah, we're not going to debate specific actions or moral rules.
Exactly. Instead, we're going meta. We're going to zoom out and examine the very foundations of those judgments.
It's like we're asking, what are we even doing when we talk about right and wrong?
Right. It's like instead of arguing about the best way to play chess, we're questioning the rules of chess themselves. Do they make sense? Are they arbitrary? Where do they even come from? That's the kind of territory we're exploring today.
So let's set the stage for our deep dive, shall we? In the simplest terms, could you explain what moral cognitivism is all about?
Well, in a nutshell, moral cognitivism is the view that when we make moral statements, like stealing is wrong, we're expressing beliefs that can be true or false, just like any other factual claim.
It's like saying the earth is round. It's either true or it's not, right?
Exactly. Cognitivists see moral statements as aiming to describe some kind of moral reality, some objective standard of right and wrong.
Okay, so where does non-cognitivism fit into this picture?
Yeah,
It sounds like it would be on the other side of that philosophical chessboard.
you got it. Non-cognitivists take a very different stance. They say, hold on a second, moral statements don't actually express beliefs at all.
Whoa, wait a minute. So they're saying when I say lying is bad, I'm not stating a belief. How can that be?
Well, they argue that moral statements might be expressions of emotions, or maybe they're prescriptions for action, or perhaps something else entirely. They're not trying to represent some objective moral truth.
So it's like when a sports fan yells boo at a bad call by the ref, they're not describing some objective fact about the game. They're just expressing their disapproval.
That's a great analogy. Non-cognitivists would say you're doing something similar when you make a moral judgment. You're expressing your stance, not describing a fact.
So the big question then for our deep dive is, what are we really doing when we make moral judgments? Are we trying to represent a moral reality, or are we doing something else entirely?
And here's where things get really interesting. Both cognitivists and non-cognitivists agree that there are no objective moral properties or facts out there in the world.
Hold on. They both agree on that. That seems counterintuitive. How can they both agree on that if they have such different starting points?
That's what makes this debate so intriguing. They both end up at the same seemingly paradoxical conclusion, but they get there in very different ways.
I'm sensing there's a lot to unpack here, so let's tease apart these definitions a bit more. Starting with cognitivism. If I'm a cognitivist, what exactly am I committing to when I make a moral statement?
Well, as a cognitivist, you'd be saying that a statement like, charity is good, is expressing a belief that can be true or false. You're claiming there's some fact of the matter about whether charity is truly good, even if that fact is hard to define.
So it's like saying there's a planet beyond Neptune, even if we haven't directly observed it yet. The truth is out there,
Yeah.
somewhere.
Right. But now let's switch gears and put on our non-cognitivist hats. What happens to that same statement, charity is good, from a non-cognitivist perspective?
Well, if I'm a non-cognitivist, I wouldn't be claiming it's true or false in any objective sense.
Nope, you wouldn't.
So what would I be doing?
You'd be expressing a non-cognitive attitude, like a feeling of approval towards charity.
So instead of describing the world, I'm expressing myself.
That's a great way to put it. And that distinction, as you can imagine, leads to some really profound implications for how we understand moral language, reasoning, and even disagreement.
All right, so I'm starting to see how these two positions differ. But I'm curious, how did philosophers even get to this point? Was there some philosophical earthquake that shifted the ground beneath our feet?
Well, one of the big philosophical tremors that really shook things up was G.E. Moore's famous open question argument. It was a major stepping stone toward non-cognitivism.
Ah, Moore. Always love a good Moore puzzle. So remind me what that argument is all about.
Moore argued that if good really referred to some natural property, then it shouldn't make sense to ask, is it good, after we've fully described something using natural properties.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say you're a hedonist, meaning you believe pleasure is the ultimate good. You might say something like, anything that produces pleasure is good.
So a delicious slice of chocolate cake is good because it gives you pleasure.
Precisely. But Moore would say, even after you've fully explained the cake's pleasurable qualities, it still makes sense to ask, but is it good?
Yeah, that's true. I might wonder if it's good for my health, or if eating it would violate some moral principle, even though it's pleasurable.
That's Moore's point. It seems like we can always raise the "is it good" question, no matter how thoroughly we've described something in other terms. And this led Moore to believe that good doesn't refer to some natural property at all. It's doing something else, something more like expressing an attitude.
So this was a big win for the non-cognitivists.
It was a huge boost for their position. It provided a powerful reason to think that moral terms aren't about picking out properties in the world, but rather about expressing something subjective.
So they're saying that if good were just about pleasure, or any other natural property, then we wouldn't even have these complex moral debates.
That's a key part of their argument. And it leads us to another cornerstone of the non-cognitivist view, Hume's law.
Right. Hume's law states that you can't derive an ought from an is. You can't jump from facts about the world to moral conclusions.
Exactly. You can gather all the facts you want about how a certain action affects the world, but that alone won't tell you whether it's right or wrong.
So if I'm a non-cognitivist arguing about social policy, I might say, look, even if we know this policy will increase poverty, that doesn't automatically make it wrong. We need to consider our feelings and attitudes towards poverty, not just the facts.
Exactly. You're highlighting how non-cognitivists believe moral judgments require something more than just facts. They need that extra ingredient, that feeling of approval or disapproval.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense. So we've got Moore questioning the nature of good, and Hume reminding us that facts alone don't equal moral judgments. Where do you go from here?
Well, if we're going to accept for the moment that moral statements aren't actually about beliefs, then the next question is, what are they then? And that's where the different flavors of non-cognitivism come in.
Flavors. That sounds a lot more appetizing than dry philosophical theory.
I know, right? Makes it a bit more fun. So we've got emotivism, which basically says that moral judgments are expressions of emotions.
So saying murder is wrong is like saying, ew, murder, I hate it.
Yeah, it's like expressing your disgust rather than stating some objective truth about murder.
Interesting. Okay, what other flavors do we have?
We've also got prescriptivism. This one sees moral statements as a kind of command.
Ah, okay, so instead of murder, yuck, it's more like don't murder.
Precisely. It's like giving an order or instruction rather than describing the world.
I see. So it's less about feelings and more about telling people what to do.
Exactly. Think of it like a moral rule book, a guide for action.
All right, so we've got emotivism, all about emotions, and prescriptivism, all about commands. But these both seem pretty different from how we normally talk about morality. Is there a flavor that tries to bridge that gap?
There is, and it's a bit of a chameleon in the world of non-cognitivism. It's called quasi-realism.
Quasi-realism, that's a mouthful. What's that all about?
Quasi-realists try to explain why we talk as if moral statements are true or false, even though they don't think there's actually any objective moral reality.
So they're trying to make sense of why we say things like, it's true that stealing is wrong, even though they don't believe in moral truth in the traditional sense.
Exactly. They might argue that we talk this way because moral language is so deeply ingrained in our lives. It guides our actions. It helps us express our values. It allows us to have these complex social interactions.
It's like saying, look, even if there's no ultimate moral rule book out there, we still need to talk and act as if there is, just to keep society from falling apart.
That's a great way to put it. Quasi-realism is all about capturing that as-if element of moral discourse. It's a clever attempt to reconcile this non-cognitivist view with the way we actually use moral language.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these different flavors of non-cognitivism add some much-needed nuance to the discussion. But, I got to be honest, I'm still wrestling with this whole idea that moral statements aren't expressing beliefs. It just feels so counterintuitive.
I get that. It's definitely a big shift from how we typically think about morality. And it leads to some interesting challenges for non-cognitivists, especially when we start to examine more complex sentences, those that contain moral judgments within them.
You're talking about what you call the embedding problem, right?
Exactly.
Do you remind us what that's all about?
Sure thing. So the embedding problem pops up when we try to figure out how these non-cognitivist theories handle sentences that go beyond those simple pronouncements like lying is wrong.
So sentences like, if lying is wrong, then we shouldn't teach our children to lie. Or, I believe that helping others is a good thing.
Exactly. These kinds of sentences embed moral judgments within larger grammatical structures. And this poses a challenge for non-cognitivists, because if lying is wrong is just an emotional outburst, like, boo, lying, then how do we make sense of the if-then or I believe that part?
It's like you're trying to build a house out of emotional Legos. The basic blocks don't quite fit together.
That's a fantastic analogy. So the question becomes, how can non-cognitivists explain these complex ways we use moral language without having to resort to the idea of beliefs?
It sounds like they've got their work cut out for them. So what are some of the solutions they've come up with?
Well, they've gotten pretty creative. One approach is to argue that these complex sentences actually express higher order attitudes.
Higher order attitudes.
Okay.
I'm going to need a bit more explanation on that one. What does it mean to have an attitude about an attitude?
All right, think about it this way. Imagine you absolutely despise pineapple on pizza.
Oh, don't even get me started on that culinary abomination.
Right. So that's your basic attitude towards pineapple on pizza. You hate it. But you might also have a higher order attitude about that attitude, like being proud of your unwavering hatred for pineapple on pizza.
So it's like saying, I'm proud of how much I detest this pizza topping. It's like a meta attitude, right?
Yeah.
An attitude about an attitude.
Exactly. It's a second-level attitude. And non-cognitivists can apply this idea to explain these embedded sentences. For example, if lying is wrong, then we shouldn't teach our children to lie, might express approval of a pattern of disapproval.
So I'm basically saying, I approve of disliking lying, and I also approve of disliking people who teach lying.
You got it. That higher order attitude could explain why someone would accept the whole sentence, even if they don't believe there's some objective truth about lying being wrong.
I see. That's pretty clever.
Hmm.
But I can imagine some philosophers, especially those on the cognitivist side, pushing back on this. Wouldn't they just say, okay, now you have to explain what these higher order attitudes are. You're just kicking the can down the road.
That's a valid point. And it gets even trickier when we look at other kinds of embedded sentences. Like, how would a non-cognitivist explain something like, I wonder if lying is wrong?
Yeah, that does get a bit thorny. Am I wondering if I disapprove of lying? That seems strange.
Exactly. It's not as simple as explaining those basic pronouncements. So yeah, non-cognitivists have had to develop some more sophisticated tools to grapple with this embedding problem.
What other strategies have they come up with? Because I imagine this embedding issue is a pretty big hurdle for them.
Another approach is to appeal to what's called minimalism about truth.
Minimalism about truth. Okay, break that down for me.
Basically, minimalists argue that truth isn't some profound metaphysical property. It's a much simpler concept, tied to how we use language in a consistent way.
So instead of saying lying is wrong, is true or false in some cosmic sense, they're saying it's true or false in a more pragmatic, everyday sense based on how it fits with our other beliefs and statements.
Exactly. It's a way of taking the air out of the concept of truth. And it's helpful for non-cognitivists because it allows them to explain how moral statements can be part of these more complex sentences without having to come up with all sorts of higher-order attitudes.
So a minimalist non-cognitivist might say that it's true that stealing is wrong. Just means something like, I accept the statement stealing is wrong.
You're getting it. They're trying to give an account of truth that doesn't commit them to believing in these objective moral facts. It's more like saying, this statement makes sense within my moral framework, even if that framework isn't anchored in some absolute truth.
I can see how that could be appealing to a non-cognitivist. It acknowledges that moral language has its own logic and rules, even if those rules aren't based on some external moral reality.
Absolutely. Minimalism provides them with a tool to address the embedding problem without giving up on their core commitment to the idea that moral judgments are not fundamentally about beliefs.
That's pretty clever. But I'm guessing this isn't the end of the story. Are there any other major challenges that non-cognitivists have to grapple with?
You bet. There are plenty more philosophical hurdles they have to clear, but that's what makes this whole debate so engaging. It pushes us to really question our assumptions about what morality is all about.
Okay, so we've seen how non-cognitivists deal with some pretty tough philosophical questions. But I'm wondering, do they have any arguments in their favor? Any positive reasons to think their view is right, not just ways of dodging objections?
Oh, absolutely. They've got some compelling arguments up their sleeve. Some of them come from really fundamental questions about, like, what's real and how we fit into the universe. One big motivation for non-cognitivism is the idea of naturalism.
So naturalism is this view that everything can be explained by natural laws and processes, no need for any supernatural stuff.
Exactly, and that's super appealing to many non-cognitivists. They say if you're on board with this naturalistic picture of the world, then you should be really skeptical about weird, non-natural moral facts just floating around.
It's like saying, look, we can explain how galaxies formed, how life evolved, even how the human brain works, all through natural processes. Why do we need to throw in moral facts too?
Right, it seems like a stretch. Non-cognitivists argue that adding these extra non-natural things is messy, and it doesn't really fit with the scientific view.
So instead of trying to squeeze moral facts into our scientific picture, they reinterpret what we're doing with moral language.
Yeah. Non-cognitivism lets you keep talking about morality without having to invent these mysterious moral properties. You get to keep the moral talk without cluttering up your picture of what exists.
I can see how that would be a big plus for folks already leaning toward a naturalistic worldview. It's a pretty elegant solution.
hmm
Are there any other arguments for non-cognitivism that go beyond responding to critics?
Oh, yeah, there are. Another one centers on this idea called motivational internalism. It's the idea that there's this close connection between our moral judgments and our motivations to act.
It's like if you genuinely believe something's morally wrong, you should at least feel some pull not to do it. Like if you believe lying is always wrong, you shouldn't be, out there lying all the time.
Right, exactly. Now, cognitivists, they have to do some fancy footwork to explain how just a belief about something being wrong can have this motivational force. It seems like beliefs by themselves don't always push us to act.
Yeah, you could believe exercise is good for you, but still end up on the couch all day. Belief doesn't always translate into action.
Exactly. But non-cognitivists have a much easier time with this. If moral judgments are at their core about, say, expressing feelings or giving commands, well, it makes sense that they'd be tied to motivation.
Because for them, the motivational part is already built in. It's not like you have to add motivation on top of the belief.
Exactly. Feelings and desires, they're way more directly linked to action than beliefs. So non-cognitivism offers a pretty neat solution to this whole moral motivation puzzle.
So we've got naturalism and motivational internalism giving non-cognitivism some extra points. But you've hinted that it's not all smooth sailing. What are some of the tougher challenges they face?
Well, one particularly tricky one is explaining what's called supervenience. It's this idea that moral properties depend on non-moral properties. Basically, two things can't be morally different without also being different in some other non-moral way.
So if two actions are exactly the same in every way we can observe, like their consequences and all the details,
Yeah.
then they can't be morally different.
Exactly. Now, this might seem super obvious at first, but it's tricky for non-cognitivists. If moral judgments are all about expressing our attitudes, then why should our attitudes be constrained by these non-moral facts about the world?
Seems like I should be able to approve or disapprove of anything, regardless of the details of the situation.
That's the worry. So non-cognitivists have to explain why supervenience holds, why our moral judgments can't just be completely detached from the facts on the ground.
What have they come up with to handle that? Sounds like a tough one.
One approach is to say, look, our attitudes themselves are often shaped by how we understand the world. Like, we might disapprove of actions that cause suffering because we've learned that suffering is bad, or just because we naturally dislike pain.
So our moral attitudes aren't just random, they're rooted in our experience and what we believe about the world.
Exactly. This helps to explain why supervenience holds. Even though moral judgments aren't directly describing these objective moral facts, they're still connected to how we see the non-moral features of the world.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But I bet a cognitivist would jump in here and say, aha, you're admitting that moral judgments are based on beliefs about the world, which is exactly what we've been saying.
You're right. They might say that. And that's just one example of how this debate, cognitivism versus non-cognitivism, gets really, really nuanced and complex. There are all these layers of argument and counter-argument.
Like a philosophical chess match, each side trying to anticipate the other's moves and come up with clever responses.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And there's no clear winner in this game. Both cognitivism and non-cognitivism have their strong points and their weaknesses, their good arguments and their challenges.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. We've explored those core differences between cognitivism and non-cognitivism, tackled the embedding problem, the puzzle of moral motivation, and even gotten into naturalism and supervenience.
And remember, we did all this like a philosopher would, digging into concepts, examining arguments, and always pushing for a better understanding of these really complicated ideas.
It's been a whirlwind tour of metaethics, but hopefully it sparks some curiosity in our listeners. Maybe they'll even start seeing the world a little differently, questioning their own ideas about right and wrong.
Who knows, maybe it's even inspired some folks out there to create their own theories of moral language. Would they side with the cognitivists or the non-cognitivists? Or would they forge a whole new path through these tricky philosophical waters? That's something worth thinking about as we wrap up our exploration today.